Humanae Vitae states that every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relation to the procreation of life. The encyclical states that any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation is morally illicit. John Paul II's Veritatis Splendor, and I'm going to call that VS, just short to this, published 25 years after Humanae Vitae and recalling the latter's teaching, affirms what are intrinsically evil acts and identifies contraception as such an act. My purpose will be to identify the vision of the human being and God that sustains the claims of these two encyclicals regarding the existence of intrinsically evil acts, while bringing into relief the vision which would, on the contrary, undermine that claim of intrinsically, that there are such things as intrinsically evil acts. The context of my reflections is set, on the one hand, by the nest of issues embedded in what is called modernity, and on the other by the debate that has arisen in connection with the apostolic exhortation Amoris laetitia. Amoris laetitia states that the church must, quote, in no way desist from proposing the full ideal of marriage. A lukewarm attitude, any kind of relativism, or any undue reticence in proposing that ideal would be a lack of fidelity to the gospel. At the same time, the exhortation says, quote, that conscience can also recognize with sincerity and honesty what for now is the most generous response which can be given to God, and come to see with a certain moral security that it is what God himself is asking amid the concrete complexity of one's limits, while not yet fully the objective ideal. My paper examines the foundations and nature of moral action in light especially of this language of ideal that operates centrally in the current discussion. To set the terms for the argument, I will frame briefly the approaches in turn, first of the pre-modern Christian thought, ancient medievals, second, modernity, modern Christian thought, thirdly, Veritatis Splendor, finally, Amoris laetitia, and then in a final section, attempt to provide a summary reflection on the state of the question as it concerns our theme. So you will forgive me if I do some schematic summary here in the first couple of stages. That's a lot to cover. So, pre-modernity. We begin by citing several texts that indicate the approach of patristic medieval theologians, and these, I want to cite these because they set the framework for the entire discussion. St. Basil says that the love of God is not imposed on us from outside, but is a constitutive element of our rational being. Cardinal Ratzinger says, in light of this, and similar other similar patristic texts, he speaks of a primal remembrance of the good and the true that is bestowed on us, what he calls conscience as anamnesis, memory. Ratzinger says further, the love of God takes on specific form in the commandments, is not opposed on us from outside, rather it is infused in us a priori. And then we have the well-known words of Augustine, God is higher than my highest self and more intimate to me than I am to myself. And St. Thomas affirms that we seek God implicitly in everything we do and know him implicitly in everything. We're aware of him implicitly in everything we know. So I would summarize the approach of the patristic medieval theologians in light of these texts in three features. First, and these are important, first, that the origin of creatures is the God and thus the fullness of actuality that is generous, the source of all goodness and truth. Second, all human beings participate in this original generosity and thus of their very nature in God's goodness and truth. Their exercise of freedom is never first or simply a choice between objects, but always participates in the good initiated by God. And thus man cannot but ever seek God implicitly in all that he does. The basic truth to be affirmed regarding creatures' being and acting then regards their participated, hence responsive generosity that renders them by nature at once good and lovers or seekers of the good, God. We are at root lovers who want to love above all God, and we are empowered to do so with the integrity of our given nature. Not because we are the first initiators of love, but because we are first loved by God and participate in this love. Third, the moral ought connected with law is intrinsically tied to, though not strictly deducible from, and it's also inspired and informed by what man most by nature loves and seeks. Again, God above all things, and myself inside this love of God, or again, the good and the true as communicated by the mind and will of God. The obligation characteristic of natural law is thus never burdensome in itself. On the contrary, it becomes burdensome only by virtue of sin, the privation of the good. Sin can obscure the memory of God and the good, but never eliminate it. Second now, modernity. Modernity provides a contrast with respect to each of the points highlighted in this sketch of the ancient classical period. Insofar as the God of modernity is transcendent, he remains essentially distant, ordering worldly beings from outside. Moral law is imposed from without. It is not at the same time an interior order indicating what it is that I myself by nature participate in and desire by virtue of God's creative initiative. God's creative power is viewed as essentially effective power, unintegrated by the communication of goodness and truth. God's law in this context itself takes on the character basically of a burden, because as communicated from outside, it needs to be appropriated first of all by man's own power, without the participatory power of love granted to me by nature in God's creating me. Serve Pinker's treatment of modern moral theology is very important here. Noting the decisive influence of William of Ockham, Pinker traces how what he calls the explosion of nominalism in the 15th through 17th centuries changes the essential structure of moral theology that was characteristic of the fathers of the church up through St. Thomas. Morality involves the embrace of truth and love, and therefore love is not merely a subjective phenomenon. Of its nature, love poses objective demands. In the name of a new conception of action, centered in what Pinker terms freedom of indifference, and a correspondingly new concept of a transcendent God understood in terms of omnipotent and inscrutable freedom, there emerged in modernity a tendency that set aside natural inclinations and de-emphasized the virtues, favoring a moral law that now stressed obligation. The two poles of moral theology, in a word, were now obligation and freedom. With this, Pinker states, a chasm was fixed between modern moralists and patristic tradition. The crucial point was that modern ethics assumed the internal logic of a morality of obligation, which made obligation a matter of God's arbitrary will. Conscience replaced the virtue of prudence, and modern moral theory became a conscience-ordered casuistry. In light of Pinker's discussion, we may say in sum that the structural poles of modern Catholic moral theory became an objectivist law understood as a matter of obligation, drained of any participation in the generous power of God's truth and goodness and love, coupled with a subjectivist freedom of indifference, marked by an extrinsic relation to the same law whose obligatoriness lacked participation in the generous power of God. The result is that the burdensomeness of the moral law is now due first to the law itself and its obligatoriness, which no longer involve man's inner participation by nature in God's communication of goodness and truth. Veritatis Splendor. Okay. The encyclical opens with these words: the splendor of truth shines forth in all the works of the Creator, and in a special way in man, centered in the image and likeness of God. Truth enlightens man's intelligence and shapes his freedom, leading him to know and love the Lord. Hence the psalmist prays, "Let the light of your face shine on us, O Lord." End of quotation. The distinguishing feature of VS in its recuperation of pre-modern patristic medieval thought, with its primacy of God and the good lying at the origin of the human action, or the action of a human subject, is its recuperation of this in a way that incorporates while transforming modernity's emphasis on the subject. The very title, Veritatis Splendor, indicates the heart of its teaching. The objective truth is a matter of splendor, and thus of a light that shines and attracts, drawing the moral subject towards it. Truth in its objective givenness is beautiful, true and good, in a way that communicates itself to the subject, a human subject, while simultaneously drawing the subject towards it. The human subject finds his exercise of freedom from the outset and all along his moral journey inspired and informed by this splendorous truth. What VS deepens with respect to the pre-modern tradition emerges in the face of modernity's split between the orders of objectivity, the moral law, and subjectivity, freedom. We have noted the effect of this split in the sphere of moral theology. VS in this context renews the pre-modern tradition by returning God's law with its essential interiority to the original meaning of both the objective obligatoriness and the subject, the free, now participatory agent of moral action. The result is that VS transforms the nature and method of modern moral theology. On the one hand, the objective obligatory order of the moral law is tied to the primacy of God's generous activity, to his goodness that elicits, even as it initially informs the free response of the creature. On the other hand, the subjective freedom of man is now always already formed in the call to follow the order of love, carried objectively in his nature as created and expressed in what is termed the natural law. It is in this context, now we turn to intrinsically evil acts. It is in this context then, still with Veritatis Splendor, that we properly understand the nature and necessity of recognizing human acts that are intrinsically evil. The key is that the creature bears within himself by nature an order of truth and goodness, indicating the creature's participation in God's love. And some kinds of free human action, for example, contraception and adultery, by virtue of their specific character, violate or contradict this natural order of love always and everywhere and independently of the intention or circumstances of the human subject of such acts. The encyclical states that these actions may indeed involve different degrees of subjective culpability. However reduced this subjective culpability may be in a given instance, such acts nonetheless always intrinsically subvert the natural order. Once again, this is because the human subject remains by nature in his own free action, ever a participant in an order of truth and goodness that expresses objectively the mind and will of God. The human subject remains ever bound by the demands of this objective order, and the burdensomeness of these demands is never due to the demands themselves, but only to sin. 2 points are especially important here. First, the existence of intrinsically evil acts points to the seriousness with which God takes the subjective freedom of man, points to the dignity of man. God permits man to make evil choices, and God responds neither by coercing that freedom nor by denying that an evil action, one's evil action, that there may be an action that exercised or performed by the human being that is intrinsically evil. Okay, so denying neither the intrinsic evilness of the action nor coercing freedom. On the contrary, this is the second point, God, so to speak, manifests his infinite love ever more deeply by assuming evil's negative, privative character and effects in his incarnate Son, Jesus Christ, who suffers crucifixion and death, martyrdom, on our behalf, and who, so to speak, assimilates himself to us through this suffering without preempting our own freedom, but on the contrary, liberating it into its deepest depths and indeed greatest risks as free. Indeed, what is indispensable for us to see here is that this action by God in Jesus Christ reveals simultaneously how profoundly evil our disordered acts may be, while disclosing at the same time how great is our dignity as free actors. Here we see the root meaning of accompaniment and mercy, which is God-centered, while at the same time man-centered, albeit not in the modern sense. In sum, Veritatis Splendor teaches us that the moral law is a command of God's will only as the order of his love. God's moral commandments and God's merciful love that accompanies us and reveals our dignity ever more deeply have the same origin, God's splendorous truth revealed in creation and in Jesus Christ. Fourth part, Amoris, laetitia, and its interpreters. First, let me state what the thesis of my argument will be. My thesis is, at this point, my contention is that Amoris laetitia, as read by its main interpreters, in its intended rejection of the assumptions of modern Catholic moralists, the manualists, for example, that are criticized by Pinkers, itself unwittingly repeats those assumptions in a dialectically inverse form. That's the thesis. It does not transform modernity. It repeats modernity in dialectically inverse form. That's what the issue is. Veritatis Splendor transforms it. Okay. I'll be explaining that. Their arguments leave in place, the interpreters leave in place an extrinsic relation between an objectivistically conceived moral law on the one hand and a subjectivistically conceived human freedom on the other. They continue to assume a moral subject equipped with an empty freedom on the one hand, faced with the heavy objective demands of the moral law on the other. So with a moral subject intending an ideal rather than already participating in the goodness and truth as communicated by God and participated by nature in the human being. With the language of ideal, something new has been injected into the discussion, and that's the question we need to examine. Does that soften my claim? Okay? Does that suffice to transform modernity, the problems with modernity? That's my question. And I'm going to, in very rapid fashion, give some quotations which I think are quite representative of what I'm talking about. And in turn, but rapid, Cardinal Schindler, Cardinal Supich, and Archbishop Fernandez. They're all known, well-known interpreters of the exhortation. In an interview in America magazine, Schindler states that we need an approach that does not renounce the ideal or the patrimony of doctrine, but that has the courage to look at families as they are, not as projections of the imagination. He repeats explicitly here what Francis himself states, Pope Francis at the beginning of AL, that, quote, the Word of God does not manifest itself as a sequence of abstract texts, but rather as a traveling companion. The Pope, Schönborn says, is summoning us to self-criticism in the pastoral sphere and drawing our attention to the great ideological temptations, which he has also called Pelagian, that can lead us astray with regard to reality. Here is the great pedagogical, these are all quotations unless I indicate otherwise. Here is the great pedagogical truth. It is the attractiveness of the good that motivates and gives the strength to walk along this path where the Father, God, attracts us and searches for us no matter what our situation. The positive pastoral style means accompaniment along the path of growth. This is what is meant by the law of graduality. The human being gradually moves forward through the progressive integration of the gifts of God. The positive pastoral style is also a way of expounding doctrine in a gentle manner, linking it to the profound motivations of men and women. With St. Pope Francis, he says, Schönborn says, the Church is now consolidating an approach to marriage and to the family, no longer from above, but from below. It is a patient realism. This is what gives the key to chapter 8. So, and he summarizes, we turn our backs on the ethics of obligation, which have an extrinsicism that generates both laxity and rigorism. And we rejoin the great tradition of Catholic moral theology, which allows us to integrate the entire contribution of personalism. The Cardinal says in another interview in relation to this, that the concept, and he says this in more than one context, but that the concept of the, quote, bonum possibile, the possible good in moral theology, is an important concept that has been too often neglected. He asks, what is the possible good that a person or a couple can achieve in difficult circumstances? That's all Schönborn. Now, Cardinal Supich of Chicago, in his well-known address at Cambridge last year, or a couple of years ago now, I guess, lists principles in which he points toward what he terms Pope Francis's revolution of mercy. He says, for example, that the synodal church, while proposing the full ideal of marriage, takes the core goal of formal teaching on marriage to be accompaniment, not the pursuit of an abstract set of rules. Supich stresses the role of conscience in enabling the ideal to be more fully realized, quote, amid the concrete complexity of one's limits, while recognizing that one's action may not fully represent the objective ideal. Supich says that conscience, in which is present the voice of God or the aboriginal vicar of Christ, could very well affirm the necessity of living at some distance from the Church's understanding of the ideal. Finally, Archbishop Fernandez, presumably, I think it was the first drafter, but he's from Argentina, first drafter of the first text, I think, of Amoris Laetitia, says, if the act remains objectively immoral and does not lose its objective gravity, then it is not possible that it can be chosen with conviction as if it were part of the Christian ideal. What Francis is saying, rather, is that in a context of attenuated culpability, one seeks to respond to the will of God with a greater commitment possible in the context of the situation. These attempts can be objects of a personal choice, and they are examples of that possible good that can be realized within the limits of the situation itself. He states further, conscience is called to recognize what for now, again citing Amoris Laetitia, is the most generous response which can be given to God, the commitment which God himself is asking amid the concrete circumstance complexity of one's limits. We must avoid, Fernandez says, disincarnate reason and intellectual Pelagianism. Now, I suggested above that the interpreters of AL dialectically repeat the terms of modern moral theology, and I meant this by this that their interpretation rejects the priority of the law in favor of the subject of freedom, all the while it continues to assume a primitive extrinsicism between the terms freedom and the law. How is this criticism to be read in light of the above comments? The theologians cited all hold that the moral truth expressed in the law, to be sure, has its source in God, and that our lives are to be directed toward this truth. The crucial question concerns the sense in which this moral doctrinal truth is judged ideal. The language of ideal normally implies distance, in that it points to something that is ahead of us, and intended and toward which we are moving, and indeed, which indeed motivates our action, but still remains abstract, except insofar as we, so to speak, make it real over the course of our moral journey. My argument is that the ideal remains distant and abstract, except insofar as it bears, will remain so, will in fact remain that way, except insofar as it bears a significant actual presence within the origin of each act of freedom. This is indeed the burden of the entire pre-modern theological tradition. Moral action as conceived in these pre-modern thinkers presupposes the presence of God, in whose generous communication of the good we participate already from the first moment of our existence and in each of our acts of freedom. Here then is the crux of the matter. We must integrate the good into the original structure of freedom, otherwise we are left with a freedom that is originally empty, logically indifferent. But how can a good that is ideal move the will via attraction if the good is not already effectively formally present within freedom in its original nature as free? The arguments of the interpreters cited beg this question, even as their comments favor the response of modern moral theologians, namely a freedom heading toward a possible good. And they do it in this way, that freedom is heading toward a possible good that bears no intrinsic initial participation into what may be termed what my term I would use, the bonum actuale et personale, that is, the actual and personal good by nature. No original participation in the good that the actual personal God has already initially integrated into the very roots of my freedom. The issue here, though subtle, is scarcely arcane. How we answer it determines nothing less than whether we have escaped nominalism and Pelagianism. The issue, the question that seems to me begged by the interpreters, in other words, is whether our freedom by nature participates in the good generously communicated to us by God in creating us. This is what I meant when I suggested that these interpreters of AL leave us with what remains essentially the problem of moral theory, albeit now in dialectically inverted form. These interpreters, however unwittingly, remain under the influence of modern nominalism and Pelagianism, albeit now from the side that favors originally empty freedom. It is not that the ideal intended by action is not important and indeed essential, obviously. The point is that lacking original and abiding participation by nature in the generous initiative of God and His goodness, the goodness that's diffusive as well as attractive, the human subject in his freedom is still left alone to choose by himself, now arbitrarily, what is good and to realize it for the first time. Lacking this original participation in actuality, the subject's ideal good takes on eo ipso the character of an abstract idea in the modern sense. Okay, so my final section then. Where do we stand on that? That's the bare bones of an argument. And it has to do, when they talk about this, an end goes back to Plato and Aristotle. There's the idea as it's bandied about often, I use it in quotes here, it's not what Plato or Aristotle in their different ways meant by idea, which is rooted in the form of things. Otherwise, you still are left with nominalism and then Pelagianism. Okay, Veritatis Splendor then. Where do we stand in the current ecclesial situation with respect to Veritatis Splendor and the discussion surrounding Amoris laetitia? Let me begin by citing a very important passage here, and it was noted by Father Denoya last night, or at least general reference to this passage. John Paul II says in the encyclical, this is the first, paragraph 115, this is the first time that the magisterium of the church has set forth in detail the fundamental elements of the church's moral teaching regarding Veritatis Splendor, and presented the principles for the pastoral discernment necessary in practical and cultural situations which are crucial and complex and even crucial. Each of us knows how important is the moral teaching which represents the central theme of this encyclical and which is today being restated with the authority of the successor of Peter. Each of us can see the seriousness of what is involved, not only for individuals but also for the whole of society, with the reaffirmation of the universality and immutability of the moral commandments, particularly those which prohibit always and without exception intrinsically evil acts. In acknowledging these commandments, Christian hearts in our pastoral charity listen to the call of the one who first loved us. God asks us to be holy as he is holy, to be in Christ perfect as he is perfect. The unwavering demands of that commandment are based on God's infinitely merciful love. That is a paragraph or a selection from partial quote of paragraph 115. First of all, Amoris laetitia, though it deals in significant ways with the human moral actions that are the focus of VS, neither quotes from, as noted last night, neither quotes from nor cites this encyclical, in which the church deals for the first time with the fundamental nature of morality, and with the express authority of Peter, this is successor of Peter. This formal omission is not without implication with regard to the substantive arguments that A.L. advances regarding moral action. And I want, in conclusion, to comment on those consequences in terms of what the situation is that we're dealing with now. Two principles guide my comments. First, a genuine development of doctrine in the church presupposes fidelity to earlier doctrine. As Cardinal Newman puts it in his appeal to the metaphor of an organism, if a tree is to grow to maturity as an oak tree, it must bear the memory of the essential order of the acorn at each step of its growth. Failure of memory will corrupt the original identity. In a word, faithful memory is the necessary condition for genuine development. Second, the primary and essential duty of the successor of Peter is to secure the unity of the Catholic faith in its integrity as communicated by Jesus Christ. My purpose in light of these two assumptions is to focus briefly what seems to me to be the very significant disagreement between VS and AL regarding the central claim of Veritatis Splendor, that there exist evil human actions that are always and everywhere intrinsically evil, independently of the subject's intentions and circumstances. A false judgment, and here's a key point that I'll just elaborate a bit here. A false or ambiguous judgment regarding the existence and nature of intrinsically evil acts entails of its inner logic, even if unintentionally, a false or ambiguous understanding of God and of creation and redemption. So first, so I'm going to begin here very quickly because I think it's important. I won't quite quote all of them, but side by side, two central paragraphs from the two documents. From Veritatis Splendor, reason attests that there are objects of the human act which are by their nature incapable of being ordered to God because they radically contradict the good of the person made in his image. There are acts which in the Church's moral tradition have been termed intrinsically evil, and I'll repeat that, you've heard it before. Only in the mystery of Christ's redemption do we discover the concrete possibilities of man. It would be a very serious error to conclude that the Church's teaching is essentially only an ideal which must then be adapted, proportioned, graduated to the so-called concrete possibilities of man according to a balancing of the goods in question. But what are the concrete possibilities of man? The encyclical goes on. This is what is at stake, the reality of Christ's redemption. Christ has redeemed us. This means that he has given us the possibility of realizing the entire truth of our being. He has set our freedom free from the dominance of concupiscence. God's command is, of course, proportioned to his capabilities, but to the capabilities of the man to whom the Holy Spirit has been given, of the man who, though he has fallen into sin, can always obtain pardon and enjoy the presence of the Holy Spirit. And then the encyclical, these are paragraphs 103, 104, 80, 80, and so on. And then the encyclical emphatically says that all kinds of circumstances and so on and good intentions can attenuate the culpability, but they don't change the species of the act. The following text then I cite from Amoris Laetitia, paragraph 303. Individual conscience needs to be better incorporated into the Church's praxis in certain situations which do not objectively embody our understanding of marriage. Naturally, every effort should be made to encourage the development of an enlightened conscience formed and guided by the responsible and serious discern of one's pastor, and to encourage an ever greater trust in God's grace. Yet conscience can do more than recognize that a given situation does not correspond objectively to the overall demands of the gospel. And then the text I quoted earlier, it can also recognize with sincerity and honesty what for now is the most generous response, which can be given to God, and see with a certain moral security that this is what God is asking in the concrete complexity of one's limits, while not fully the objective ideal. In any event, let us recall that this discernment is dynamic. It must be ever open to new stages of growth and to new decisions which can enable the ideal to be more fully realized. These sets of texts from VS and AL respectively, especially when read in light of the commentators on AL discussed earlier, demand clarification in relation to each other, guided by the principles indicated above regarding the authentic development of doctrine and the primary duty of the Petrine office. First, as we have been at pains to show, the claim, and this is really fundamental for my argument, the claim that there exist intrinsically evil acts implicates an entire range of judgments about the nature and foundation of moral action. As the German Catholic philosopher Robert Spemann has said, if we deny the existence of intrinsically evil acts, we fall into the proportionalism rejected in VS. If no action, and this is my text, if no action can be said to be intrinsically evil, then any particular action is possibly good. This is ethical relativism, or indeed ethical nihilism. In addition, as we have indicated, the claim regarding intrinsically evil acts presupposes a definite vision of reality and of God. It implies some conception of human nature and natural law as participatory or not, in one way or another, in the order of God's generous love. That is the essence of the ground of nominalism and Pelagianism. You get that wrong, it's nominalism and Pelagianism. So, And so my summary point then is simply that the reality of intrinsically evil acts demands one sort of vision of reality, especially regarding man, especially man in relation to God, and vice versa, even as the denial that there are such acts presupposes a different and incompatible vision of reality, man, in relation to God. This is what is at stake in the difference in language and emphasis of AL, as these involve the distinction between an intended idea centered around a bonum possibile on the one hand, and what may be termed rather, in light of VS, my term, bonum actuale et personale, that is the actual and personal good, that is the God of our creation and redemption on the other. Conclude then, an obvious question that I ask myself in this, and we all need to probe this, it's a serious matter. Doesn't it seem that we're hanging a lot, perhaps too much, on some very fine distinctions? Can't we treat the differences indicated regarding the existence of intrinsically evil acts more fairly as differences merely of accent or emphasis? Could the interpreter's formulations be interpreted rather as differences of emphasis, and shouldn't we give them the benefit of the doubt? I've outlined my argument why I think that's not possible. But the point is, it's not the persons involved, it's the logic of the positions, okay? But the second, my point in this, basic point in this context, to put it in a historical context, regarding crises, earlier crises of the church, they're all about very fine distinctions that have very important consequences. I mean, the early Nicaea, Chalcedon, Third Council of Constantinople, very fine distinction. Was Christ the first emissary of God, or was he God incarnate, etc.? It may seem extravagant to place the current debate about human moral action in such decisively important context, but that's been the point of my argument, in light of what I take to be the burden of Veritatis Splendor, namely that one's judgment regarding the existence of acts that are intrinsically evil enfolds an entire vision of reality and of God regarding the nature of man as created and redeemed, and of God as creator and redeemer. And there's many questions as we have enfolded that. As we have seen, neither the interpreters of AL nor myself would deny that both poles here, so to speak, emphasize the interpreters, and what I emphasize in the name of the tradition need to be affirmed. But my question, what I take to be the fundamental question, in what order of priority? And the consequence of one's judgment of that has to be put in a historical context of profound crises in the church. So the fundamental issue, in my opinion, that this fundamental issue must and will be faced in some basic form, if not under the present pontificate, then in a future pontificate. We can trust that the church will eventually formally engage this issue finally, for two reasons. One, God, in creating man, implanted in him a nature that in its deepest depths loves and seeks God above all things. And secondly, in redeeming man in Jesus Christ, God has left us a sacramental church. Thank you very much.